Hey y'all, it's entry number 28 of this offseason series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Brandin Cooks, wide receiver, Houston Texans. We'll start with some positives from the fantasy profile of Brandin Cooks. To start, we gotta talk about his year-to-year consistency. Brandin Cooks has had at least 65 receptions and over 1,030 receiving yards in 6 of his last 7 seasons in the league, every year but 2019, according to Pro Football Reference. The next thing I really like about Brandin Cooks' fantasy profile is that he's a deep threat in his overall air yards. Brandin Cooks has proven himself to be a very good deep ball threat over the course of his career, with his 4.33 speed, and he saw 24 deep targets, the 13th most among wide receivers in 2021, according to Player Profiler. He was also one of the better wide receivers in the air yards department during the 2021 season, with 88.0 air yards per game, 1.79 air yards per snap, and 37.1% of his team's air yards according to RotoWire. The last major positive with Brandin Cooks' fantasy profile is that he's got a new offensive play caller. The Houston Texans will have a new offensive play caller during the 2022 NFL season, going from Tim Kelly to new offensive coordinator Pep Hamilton. Hamilton's offense was pretty friendly to wide receivers during his previous stint as an offensive coordinator for the Indianapolis Colts, and it should be a good thing for Brandin Cooks' fantasy value in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with Brandin Cooks' fantasy profile. To start, we gotta talk about his history of concussions. Brandin Cooks has a pretty extensive history with concussions, with 5 occurring over the course of his NFL career thus far, once in 2015, twice in 2018, and twice in 2019. Once you get one concussion, the risk of getting another one increases, so there's a little bit of a health risk with Cooks given his history in this area. The next concern I have with his fantasy profile is his red zone usage. Brandin Cooks saw 14 red zone targets in 2020 and 10 red zone targets in 2021, according to NFL Savant. While these numbers did lead the Texans in both years, they are still below average relative to many other fantasy-relevant wide receivers going around Cooks' draft range. The last major concern I have with Brandin Cooks' fantasy profile is that he plays in a projected below-average offense. In 2021, the Houston Texans offense ranked 32nd in yards per game with 278.1 and 30th in points per game with 16.5 according to ESPN. While they could certainly be better than that in 2022, they still have a ways to go before they are good and are still likely to be a below average offense again this season. Some additional thoughts on Brandin Cooks' fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Brandin Cooks was WR20 in standard with 141.8 total fantasy points and 8.9 fantasy points per game, WR20 in half PPR formats with 186.8 total fantasy points, 11.7 fantasy points per game, and WR20 in full PPR, with 231.8 total fantasy points and 14.5 fantasy points per game in terms of total fantasy points according to Fantasy Pros. Brandin Cooks was the WR16 in standard, with 10.1 fantasy points per game, WR15 in half PPR formats with 12.8 fantasy points per game, and WR17 in full PPR formats with 15.5 fantasy points per game during the 2020 season according to Fantasy Pros. Davis Mills is once again slated to be the Houston Texans starting quarterback in 2022. Mills had a promising rookie season where he looked like arguably the second best quarterback of the 2021 QB class, putting up a stat line of 263 completions on 394 passing attempts for 2,664 passing yards and 16 passing touchdowns to just 10 interceptions over the course of 13 games, according to Pro Football Reference. The Houston Texans drafted John Metchie in the second round of the 2022 NFL Draft. Metchie tore his ACL near the end of the 2021 college football season. He could be an impact player, but we'll have to see when he makes his return. Personal opinion. Brandin Cooks is currently going off the board as WR21, about pick 57 overall, on ESPN, and WR29, about pick 86 overall, on Yahoo. Clearly, there's a huge difference in value on each of these sites, as Cooks is currently going about 30 picks later on Yahoo versus ESPN. In ESPN leagues, I don't have much interest at his current ADP, and will very rarely be getting him on that site. On Yahoo, however, he seems like a safe bet to beat expectations based on what we've seen from him over the last 7 years. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or foundation. Brandin Cooks has previously shown support for the Community Foundation of San Joaquin. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed today's entry, be sure to like and subscribe.